You ever wonder why every time they say they're protecting democracy, the middle class gets poorer? What John Bolton did with his secret files isn't just another DC scandal, it's proof that the system is rigged. The elites write the rules, they break them when it suits them, and you're the one paying the price. This isn't about politics, it's about power, corruption, and how ordinary Americans are being squeezed out of their own country. You ever notice how the people at the very top always claim they're protecting democracy, but somehow the middle class keeps shrinking? That's not an accident. What John Bolton did with his secret files isn't just about politics. It's a window into how the game is rigged and why ordinary Americans like you pay the price. Let me explain how it works piece by piece. Picture this. You're sitting at your kitchen table, maybe having your morning coffee, reading about another political scandal in Washington. Another name you've heard before, another controversy, another investigation that seems to go nowhere. You might think, well, that's just politics as usual. But what if I told you that John Bolton's story, this man who took classified notes and turned them into a personal crusade, represents something much bigger, something that directly affects whether your children can afford a house, whether your grandchildren will have the same opportunities you did, whether the America you grew up in still exists for regular hardworking families. See, John Bolton wasn't just any government official. He was Donald Trump's national security advisor, one of the most sensitive positions in our entire government. This man sat in rooms where the most classified information in the world was discussed. He had access to secrets that could affect national security, military operations, diplomatic relations with foreign countries. And what did he do with that access? He took notes. Lots and lots of notes. Now, taking notes isn't unusual for someone in government, but here's where it gets interesting. And frankly troubling, according to what we now know. Bolton was what you might call a prodigious note-taker. He wrote down everything, conversations, decisions, classified details. But here's the kicker. When he left the Trump administration in 2019, he took those notes with him, and then right in the middle of the 2020 election, he decided to turn those notes into a book called The Room Where It Happened. Think about that timing for a moment. We're talking about a man at the very center of national security, taking notes that may have contained classified detail, and then using them in a way designed to damage a sitting president during election year. That's not just politics, folks, that's a potential breach of trust at the highest level. The Trump administration tried to stop him, they went to court, they filed lawsuits, and it's fascinating. The judge, and this was very strange actually, said that Bolton wasn't doing his country any good. She said he was releasing information based on classified files through his notes that wasn't in the interest of the United States, but she didn't issue an injunction to stop him. So, the election happened, Trump lost, Biden came into office, and guess what? The new administration quietly dropped the investigation into Bolton, just like that. Case closed, move along, nothing to see here. Now you might be thinking, well, maybe there wasn't enough evidence. But let me ask you something. If your neighbor took confidential documents from their workplace and used them to hurt their former boss during a crucial business deal, what would happen to your neighbor? They'd probably lose their job, face legal consequences, maybe even go to jail. But when you're part of the right circle, when you serve the right political purposes, apparently different rules apply. And that brings us to the real question. Is this about John Bolton specifically, or is this about something much larger? Because when you start connecting the dots, you realize that Bolton's story isn't unique. It's part of a pattern that's been building for years, and it's a pattern that has everything to do with why your purchasing power keeps declining, why your neighborhood keeps changing in ways that don't benefit you, and why the people making the big decisions seem completely disconnected from your daily reality. Let me tell you about some other names you might recognize. James Clapper, former Director of National Intelligence; Andrew McCabe, former FBI; Deputy Director John Brennan; former CIA Director James Comey; former FBI Director, even Anthony Fauci. Now, what do all these people have in common? They all held positions of incredible power and trust. They all made decisions that affected millions of Americans, and they all, in various ways, used their positions in ways that seemed to serve their own interests rather than the country's. During the Biden years, these people enjoyed what you might call a free hand, a de facto clemency. They were never held accountable for decisions that hurt ordinary Americans. They were given platforms on television, book deals, speaking engagements. They became celebrities in the circles that matter to the coastal elite. Meanwhile, if you questioned their decisions, if you asked why COVID policies devastated small businesses while big corporations thrived, if you wondered why immigration policies seemed designed to undercut American workers' wages, you were labeled as some kind of extremist. You see, there's a fundamental question about deterrence here. If you don't hold powerful people accountable when they break the rules, they'll keep breaking them. If you do try to hold them accountable, it looks like you're engaging in revenge politics. It's a perfect catch-22 that protects the people at the top, while ordinary folks pay the price. But here's what really gets to me about the Bolton situation and why it matters so much to understanding what's happening to the middle class. Bolton could have handled his disagreements with Trump professionally. He could have said, "Look, I'm more of an interventionist. You're more reluctant to use military force around the world. I can't serve you anymore because I don't agree with your policies." He could have resigned quietly, maybe written a measured critique later, like other officials have done instead. He really thought, especially after the 6th of January, that Trump was finished politically. He felt that he could contribute to that downfall through the legal battles and public arguments he was having with Trump. He leaked information that his book was going to be a bombshell, a revelation of Trump's supposed illegality and sloppy style. But here's what Bolton didn't understand, and this is crucial. He had no constituency. The man had never been able to get Senate confirmation for any high-level position in a Republican administration. George W. Bush tried to get him confirmed and couldn't do it. He had to make a recess appointment when Trump was considering him. People said, "You can appoint Bolton. He cannot be confirmed by the Senate. You can only appoint him to positions that don't require confirmation." Bolton was what we might call a creature of the Sunday talk shows. He was everywhere on television, making the case that Trump was dangerous and reckless. He just wouldn't stop. It became an obsession, and he really believed that after the 2020 defeat, after the 6th of January, after all the legal troubles that followed, Trump was finished. Anyone who knew Trump understood that he's what you might call a Nietzschean figure. The more they tried to destroy him, the stronger he would get. But Bolton, like so many others in that elite circle, completely misread the situation. He's like Bill Kristol, John Kasich, MIT, Romney, all these people who went after Trump and then found themselves politically irrelevant. They thought they were on the winning side of history, but they forgot something crucial. They had lost touch with the people who actually vote, who actually work for a living, who actually struggle with rising grocery bills and rent payments. And that's where Bolton's story connects to your story, whether you realize it or not. The same arrogance that led Bolton to think he could manipulate classified information for his own purposes is the same arrogance that's been systematically undermining the middle class for decades. Let me paint you a picture of how this works. The Democratic Party, and I'm not trying to be partisan here, this is just observable reality, made a calculated decision sometime in the 1992nd and 2002nd, they looked around and said, "We don't need the middle class anymore. We are the wealthy people, but we're the good wealthy people." They partnered with the professional classes that benefited from globalization. We're not just talking about billionaires and multimillionaires, though they were certainly part of it. We're talking about the next echelon down the coastal university classes, the people with credential letters after their names, the folks who could still afford to buy homes in expensive areas, who could buy imported cars, who could send their kids to prep schools. This group convinced itself that they had solved the existential problems of the world: climate change, social justice, global governance. These became their priorities. Meanwhile, the practical problems that middle-class families face every day: how do I buy a house? How do I afford groceries? How do I pay for electricity? How do I send my kids to college without drowning in debt? These concerns were dismissed as the complaints of people who didn't understand what was really important. Middle class was labeled as clingers, deplorables, chumps, drags, and garbage. The assumption was that these were the losers of globalization, people who didn't learn how to code, as Joe Biden once said, or who didn't understand that their coal plants were going to be shut down anyway, so they should just accept it. Now here's where it gets really revealing about the mindset we're dealing with. Remember that woman who went viral after some celebrity event telling people they shouldn't go to restaurants because Mexican nationals are cooking and suggesting they should just get over there to Crack a Barrel? The corporate elite heard this and thought, oh my gosh, we can't be associated with this kind of thinking. But here's the thing, the CEOs making these decisions are mostly MBAs from elite universities. They live in the same bubble as the political class. They thought they could be really clever. They'd quietly remove anything that might appeal to what they saw as white nationalist or white supremacist customers, and nobody would object to changing a corporate logo, right? What they didn't understand is that average Americans aren't stupid. When Cracker Barrel starts removing images that reflect rural working-class culture, people understand exactly what's happening. They're being told essentially, we don't want your business because we don't like you, and we think you represent something shameful about America. The same thing happened with Bud Light's partnership with a transgender influencer, or Target's Pride Month displays in ways that seem designed to make traditional families uncomfortable. In each case, corporate leaders thought they were being sophisticated, appealing to the values of their fellow elite, while avoiding any real controversy. But what they discovered is that there's a breaking point. People get sick of being mocked, dismissed, and told that their values and concerns don't matter. And when that backlash comes, it's not just about bureau or retail stores, it's about a much deeper sense that the institutions that are supposed to serve all Americans have been captured by a relatively small group of people who actively dislike a large portion of the country. This connects directly back to John Bolton because it's the same mindset. Bolton thought he was serving the right people, the people who mattered, the people who would appreciate his insights and buy his books and invite him to the right dinner parties. He never stopped to consider that the classified information he was using might belong to the American people as a whole, not to him personally. He never considered that his timing releasing damaging material about a sitting president during an election might undermine the democratic process he claimed to be defending. The truth is, Bolton's actions and the corporate elite's actions both flow from the same source. They've convinced themselves that they're smarter, more moral and more important than the ordinary Americans whose lives are affected by their decisions. They think they know what's best for you, better than you do. And this brings us to something that might surprise you, how our universities became factories for this kind of thinking. When I was younger, universities were certainly left-leaning, but there were liberal left-leaning. There was still room for debate, still some connection to the practical needs of society. But over the past few decades, they've become what I can only describe as North Korean left-wing institutions. These universities now see their role as training the new administrative state class, the diplomats, lawyers, administrators, clerks, media people, and bureaucrats who will staff the government and major corporations, and they're all being indoctrinated with the same basic message. Ordinary Americans are the problem. Traditional American values are obstacles to progress. The middle class is selfish and ignorant and needs to be managed by people who know better. The universities stopped being American institutions and became global institutions. Their goal became training people who would see themselves as citizens of the world first, American second, if at all. They developed billion-dollar endowments by charging foreign students premium prices, and they used that money to fund radical DEI programs and hire faculty who actively despise the culture and values of the student's own country. This is where people like Bolton come from, not necessarily universities directly, but from the same mindset that sees America and Americans as problems to be solved, rather than people to be served. Now, here's where this story takes a turn. That directly affects every family in America, especially those of you who've watched your neighborhoods change over the decades. The same people who captured the universities had another brilliant idea. They were going to change the demographics of the country itself, and they were going to do it in a way that would permanently lock in their political power. This wasn't some conspiracy theory. They wrote books about it, books with titles like Demography is Destiny and the New Democratic Majority. They were triumphalist about it. They openly celebrated the strategy, but when people like Tucker Carlson pointed out what was happening and said they're deliberately changing the composition of American communities, suddenly it became the sick Great Replacement theory that no decent person was supposed to discuss. Let me tell you how this worked in practice. Ted Kennedy and I'm not picking on Democrats here. Republicans went along with this too, essentially made it impossible for Europeans or affluent people from places like Japan to immigrate easily to America. Instead, the focus shifted to what they called family reunification across the southern border. Reagan signed immigration legislation in 1986 that was supposed to be a one-time amnesty, but it opened the floodgates instead. They took Border Patrol agents off the border and made it the employer's responsibility to check I-9 forms that were easily forged, and everyone knew it. The result, we now have about 50 million people living in America who weren't born here, which is an all-time high of about 15 to 16% of the population. About 30 million of them are here illegally now. The political calculation was simple. This is our new constituency. These are people who will vote for the party that promises them the most government benefits and the most protection from immigration enforcement. But here's what they didn't count on, and this is important for you to understand. It didn't work out exactly as planned. Second generation Mexican Americans started voting more conservatively. More Asian immigrants than expected started supporting traditional values. The demographic strategy that was supposed to guarantee permanent political control began to backfire, finally becoming obvious in 2024. The damage to the middle class was already done. When you bring in 30 million people who will work for below market wages, what do you think happens to wages for everyone else when you suddenly need housing for 50 million additional people? What happens to housing costs when school systems designed for one population suddenly have to accommodate much larger numbers? What happens to educational quality? The elite response to these obvious consequences was to shame anyone who pointed them out. If you said, "My kid's school is overcrowded and my property taxes keep going up, but the quality is going down," you were called a racist. If you said, "I used to make decent money in construction, but now I'm competing with crews that undercut everyone," you were called a xenophobe. If you pointed out that your neighborhood had changed in ways that made you uncomfortable, you were clearly a white supremacist who needed to be educated about diversity and inclusion. Meanwhile, the people making these accusations lived in zip codes where none of these problems affected them personally. They had private schools for their kids, private security for their neighborhoods, and jobs that couldn't be undercut by imported labor. For them, demographic change was an abstract moral question that allowed them to demonstrate their virtue and superiority over the supposedly ignorant masses. This is exactly the same arrogance we see in John Bolton's story. He thought he could use classified information for his own purposes because he convinced himself he was serving a higher good, stopping the dangerous Trump. The people who engineered mass immigration convinced themselves they were creating a more just and diverse America, even though the main result was to crush economic opportunities for working-class Americans of all backgrounds. And if you want to see how deep this mindset goes, just look at how they talk about you when they think you're not listening. We've had prominent figures on television saying things like, "What have whites ever done with music? What have whites ever given the world? They're stupid. They can't think." Now, imagine if someone said equivalent things about any other racial group. Their career would be over immediately. There would be no sponsors, no advertisers, no platform. But when the target is white working-class Americans, it's not only acceptable, it's celebrated as speaking truth to power. This isn't just about hurt feelings, it's about a systematic effort to demoralize and marginalize the people who built this country, who still do most of the essential work, and who represent the largest voting bloc. When you convince people they have no legitimate interests, no valid concerns, and no moral standing to object to policies that hurt them, you can get away with almost anything. The people pushing these narratives didn't realize that 67% of the country identifies as white, and they don't appreciate being told they're inherently evil. They didn't realize that working-class Americans of all backgrounds have more in common with each other than with coastal elites of any color. They didn't realize that their constant demonization would eventually create a permanent backlash, and now we're seeing that backlash. People are sick of it. They're sick of being told that everything wrong with America is their fault. They're sick of seeing their tax dollars go to support people who entered the country illegally while they struggle to afford housing and health care. They're sick of watching their cultural institutions mock their values and dismiss their concerns. This is why Trump's recent decision to deploy the National Guard in Washington, D.C. is so interesting. For 8 or 9 days, there hasn't been a murder in Washington, something that hadn't happened in years. But instead of celebrating this improvement in public safety, the same people who claimed Trump was a fascist are now complaining that it's only temporary, that he's only going to keep the guard there for 30 days. Think about the logic here. They said he was going to be a dictator who would never give up power. Now they're complaining that he's limiting his intervention to 30 days. They admit that crime will probably return when the guard leaves, which means they're acknowledging that the intervention is working, but they're angry about it anyway. Why? Because if Donald Trump does something that helps ordinary people, they have to oppose it, regardless of whether it makes sense. If he wants to secure the border, they're suddenly for illegal immigration. If he wants to stop crime, they're suddenly pro-crime. It's a purely reflexive response that puts them on the wrong side of public opinion every single time. This is the same dynamic we see with John Bolton's files and the broader pattern of elite behavior. They choose their positions based not on what's good for the country, but on what's opposite to what Trump or what ordinary Americans want. The problem is Trump isn't stupid. He selects issues where public opinion is strongly on his side. Border security is supported by 70% of Americans. Deporting criminals is supported by about 55%, despite all the media hysteria. Fighting crime with federal intervention is supported by at least 55%. So when the elite automatically opposes everything Trump does, they find themselves defending positions that most Americans disagree with, and their response is to double down on the condescension, the name-calling, and the moral lectures. You see this perfectly in someone like Gavin Newsom. He'll go on television, say, "I don't know why you guys make up this Latinx stuff. Nobody says that. I've never heard it once." Then within hours, someone posts a video of him talking about the Latinx community. The internet has no amnesia, but these people act like it does. This is what I call Pete Buttigieg syndrome. The appearance of sanctimonious, scolding, talking down to people's self-righteousness. Combined with obvious dishonesty, it's saying, my pronouns, are they, them, z, or whatever, and then being surprised when normal people find that ridiculous and alienating. But here's the deeper issue, and this is where John Bolton's story connects to the bigger picture of middle-class decline. These people can't help themselves. They know that their obsessions with diversity, equity, inclusion, political correctness, and racial grievances are killing them politically. They know that normal Americans are tired of being lectured and demonized, but they're addicts. They're fixated on these ideas, and they can't stop pushing them even when it's obviously counterproductive. Donald Trump figured this out and used it to his advantage. He appeals directly to working-class Americans of all backgrounds. Over the heads of the elite gatekeepers who claim to speak for them and privately, many people are grateful for this, even if they won't say so publicly, because they're afraid of being attacked by the activists and media figures who police acceptable opinion. Think about what's happened in cities with progressive leadership. You had a mayoral race where the establishment candidates, Eric Adams, Coda Silva, and Andrew Cuomo, together got about 50% of the vote, while the radical candidate got 27%. The problem was easily solvable if they had rallied around one mainstream candidate, but that proved impossible because they were all damaged goods in different ways. So you ended up with candidates saying things like, I'm going to go after affluent white communities and we need to seize the means of production. This resonated with two groups, the subsidized poor, who thought they were going to get more free stuff, and the white professional class that makes maybe $100,000 to $150,000 a year. People who are financially comfortable but don't have the wealth to buy the kind of lifestyle they think their credentials entitled them to. This second group loves being told they're morally superior to working-class Americans. They love the idea of taking wealthy people's money as long as the definition of wealthy doesn't include them. They love radical rhetoric because it makes them feel revolutionary and important, even though they're really just comfortable functionaries in the system they pretend to oppose. But this coalition doesn't represent anything close to a majority of Americans. You can see this in how the Democratic Party has changed over the decades. Go back and look at the 1,992 and 1,996 Democratic Convention platforms that people like Mark Penn and Doug Shou wrote. They called for trying juvenile murderers as adults, hiring 100,000 new police officers, shutting down the border, deportation, legal only, immigration, energy development, and balancing the budget. That sounds pretty conservative today, doesn't it? But they won elections with those positions, even with the help of Ross Perot splitting the Republican vote. After the Bush years, Obama moved the party far to the left. Then Biden, who doesn't know who he is or what he believes, had his administration hijacked by even more radical minds. The result is a party that's completely out of touch with working Americans, but convinced of its own moral superiority. They've become exactly what John Bolton represents: people who think they're smarter and more important than everyone else who think the rules don't apply to them, and who believe their good intentions justify whatever means they choose to use. Now you might be wondering, what does this mean for you personally? What can you actually do about any of this? First, understand that middle-class decline isn't an accident or a natural economic process. It's the result of deliberate policy choices made by people who benefit from those choices. When Bolton takes classified notes and turns them into a personal vendetta, he's cashing in on his insider access. While ordinary Americans pay the price in reduced trust in government institutions, when universities indoctrinate students to hate their own culture, your tax dollars are funding that indoctrination. When immigration policies undercut American workers' wages, that's a choice, not an inevitable result of globalization. Second, recognize the patterns. When you see the same media figures who defended Bolton attacking anyone who questions the narrative, when you see the same corporate leaders who lecture you about your values while their policies make your life harder, when you see the same politicians who claim to care about working families while their donors get richer, these aren't coincidences. They're symptoms of a system that's been designed to benefit a small group at the expense of everyone else. Third, stay informed and stay engaged. The reason people like Bolton thought they could get away with manipulating classified information is that they assumed nobody was paying attention, that the complex details of government policy were too boring or complicated for regular Americans to understand. But you're not too stupid to understand. When someone is trying to deceive you and you're not too unimportant to have a voice in how your country is run. The truth is, when ordinary people wake up and demand better things change. That's the real lesson of recent elections, the real message behind consumer boycotts of companies that insult their customers, the real meaning of the political realignment we're seeing across the country, the same arrogance that led John Bolton to think he could use his government position for personal gain is the same arrogance that's been undermining the middle class for decades. But that arrogance is also a weakness. People who are convinced of their own superiority tend to underestimate everyone else. They make mistakes. They overreach. They reveal their true attitudes in ways that wake people up. John Bolton's secret files are just one chapter and a bigger story, a story about how the middle class gets undermined, mocked, and pushed aside by people who think they're smarter than you. But history shows something important. When ordinary people recognize what's happening and decide to do something about it, the people in power have to listen. That's why I make videos like this, to connect the dots, to help you see through the noise, to remind you that your concerns are legitimate and your voice matters. The Bolton story isn't really about classified documents or political revenge. It's about whether America will be run by and for ordinary Americans, or by a small group of people who see the rest of us as obstacles to their vision of progress. So here's my question for you. Do you think the middle class still has the power to turn this around? Can working Americans of all backgrounds come together to demand accountability from the people who are supposed to serve them? I had loved to hear your perspective in the comments below, and if you found this analysis useful, if it helped you understand something you sensed but couldn't quite put your finger on, do me a favor, hit like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because the more people who understand how the game really works, the harder it becomes for the players to keep cheating. The choice is ours. We can let people like John Bolton and the system that protects them continue to treat us like we don't matter, or we can remind them that in America, the people are supposed to be in charge. What do you think we should do?